Welcome back to Dramatic Readings and Personal Stories. Today we are going to be continuing reading the stories from Clue, the case of the invisible cat, which makes it sound like that it would be one large, mini novel, when really it's more a collection of smaller mysteries. And together, you and I are going to see if we can find out who done these mysteries. Today, we are on Story 3, Dressed to Kill, which reminds me of Danger by Design from Nancy Drew. Alright, so let's get to it. Mrs. White! Called Miss Scarlet, clapping her hands. My tea, please. Make that 2 teas. Mrs. White, added Mrs. Peacock. 3, said Mr. Green. 4 teas. 4 teas, Mrs. White, ordered Colonel Mustard. 6, called out Professor Plum. He means 5, Mrs. White, occurred Mr. Green. I wish she'd get here sooner, he muttered to himself. It was Monday night, and the guests were all gathered for a tea party in the dining room at Mr. Body's mansion. 'Cause you know when chaos and disorder is going on in your mansion, and you might have a murderer with you at any possible moment, you have a tea party. Just saying, this series is silly. Okay. But so far, no one had seen hide nor hair of Mrs. White. Now the doors opened. A maid in a black dress and a white apron wheeled a silver cart. At least it looked like a maid. But then the figure raised its head. Mr. Body! Cried all the guests. What on earth? It's Mrs. White's night off, exclaimed their host. His eyes twinkled merrily. I thought I'd surprise you. Colonel Mustard guffawed. Mrs. Peacock sniffed. It's vulgar. Take that dress off at once. Why, I think he is the best dressed one in the room. You're joking, said Miss Scarlet. I'm serious, Mr. Green insisted. Miss Scarlet jumped to her feet. Take that back, you ignorant buffoon! She yelled the words at Mr. Green. Admit, I'm the best dressed. Mr. Green leapt up. He was waving his wrench in his hand. Please, cried Mr. Body. He ran forward, but tripped on the maid's dress and fell flat on his face. Actually, said Plum, admiring his own outfit, I think I'm the best dressed one here. You start, said Miss Scarlet, or You'll what? Demanded Plum. He pulled his left hand out of his pocket. There was nothing in it. He looked annoyed. Then he pulled out his right. This hand held the knife. He raised his left hand high and said, Don't push me too far. Mr. Body had gotten to his feet. Please, no fighting. I beg you. You're all dressed wonderfully. But by then, fighting had broken out on all sides. A blow struck Body on the back of the head. The host fell back to the floor, and he didn't wake up again. The next morning, oomph! Grunted Mrs. White. She was straining to tie a tight knot around a tree on the edge of Mr. Body's lawn. There! She hung up the rope to use as the clothesline. Now she started hanging up the laundry. It was odd. She hadn't seen a single soul since she arrived at the mansion an hour earlier. Just then, the front door opened. Mr. Body emerged and made his way across the sloping lawn towards Mrs. White. At first, he seemed to be wearing a white hat. When he got closer, she saw that his head was wrapped with a bandage. "Hello, Mrs. White," he said. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yes," agreed the maid. "But what happened to you?" "Nothing. Don't worry about it. Feather dance, peanut trumpet." "I'm sorry?" asked the maid. "No, I'm sorry," said Mr. Body, tapping his head. "I've been having a bit of trouble talking straight this morning. Last night's dinner party got a little umbrella, I'm afraid." "Oh?" "Yes, I'm afraid the elephant banana garbage noodle." He tapped his head again. "Sorry." He tried again. "I'm afraid that the guests started arguing about who's the best dressed and—" He waved his head and said, "You can probably imagine the pancake that started." "I certainly can," said the maid. "I hope no weapons were involved." "I'm afraid they were," admitted Mr. Body. "Each of the guests had one." "How awful!" said Mrs. White. "Yes, it was. Well, the police will be here any tornado, but I don't know. What can I tell them? The events of last night were all a mystery to me. I certainly can't answer the most important questions." "You mean, who was the best dressed?" No, said Mr. Body, gently rubbing his sore head. "Who was Ducky Daddles?" "Right," said Mrs. White. She tapped his head again. Who was the best dressed?" "I have no sneaker. All I can remember is that Professor Plum was the only guest who wore his own color. And both women's dresses were lovely. But beyond that, it's all an utter marshmallow. Well, I'm going to lie down and see if I can clear my pineapple before the police get here. They'll of course want to know who was Nickel Pickle." "Yes, I'm sure they will. You have no idea who attacked whom?" "That's what I've been trying to remember," said Mr. Body with a frown. "But all I know is that the women attacked the women and the men attacked the men. Well, I better crack her." With that, he hobbled off. Mrs. White thought for a moment, but she didn't see any way to help Mr. Body solve the mystery. Then she hung up the rest of the laundry, and the events of the previous night suddenly came clear to her. Because first she hung up a scarlet red dress that was riddled with bullet holes. Okay. So somebody shot at Miss Scarlet. Wait, no, because he said that Plum was the only one in color. So all the other people were wearing not their color. Okay. Then she clothespinned up a mustard shirt that had been slit with a knife. Next came a green pair of pants with wrinkles that looked as if they had been wrenched by a wrench. Okay, so I guess they were like pinched or something. Or they had scuff marks on them. Then there was a peacock blue gown with scorch marks. Oh, the candlestick. Okay. A pair of purple plum slacks had no crease, as if they had been rolled out with a lead pipe. Mrs. White gazed at the clothes as they flapped in a stiff breeze. Which guest was wearing which outfit? She wondered. Then suddenly she had the answer. Okay. I can't say for sure who was wearing what, except for Mr. Plum. We know for sure that Mr. Plum was wearing purple because Mr. Body said so. And since he's the victim, we have to believe him. Okay, so I think it was Mr. Plum with the pipe in wherever the lounge. Okay. And as for who attacked whom, well, let's go back to the scene of the crime and try to deduct. Alright, so who had what at the time of the crime? Okay, so Plum had... Oh. I bet the lead pipe was in his, left pocket, and that's why he hesitated in bringing it out, I bet. Yeah, as far as I know, there's no real way to determine who did what to who. Except for, I think maybe... Well, we know they all have knives from the last excursion that we read, so it could be any of them. So I'm just gonna go with my guy, say that it's Mr. Purple with the lead pipe that knocked out Mr. Body. But post your own thoughts down below in the comments, because I always like to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions. Okay, get ready, because I'm about to spoil what happened. Alright, here's the solution. Mrs. Peacock was wearing the scarlet dress. Miss Scarlet was wearing the peacock dress gown. Plum was clad in purple slacks. Mr. Green wore the mustard shirt, and Colonel Mustard had on the green pants. Okay. So, Scarlet shot Peacock, and Peacock sliced Scarlet's dress, I think. Is that what they said? Hold on. What did they say the conditions of the outfits were? Okay, yeah, so Scarlet shot Peacock. And then But why would they want to hurt their own clothes? We know this because we know that only Plum wore his own colors. Both women wore dresses, for example, and the mustard shirt had to be worn by one of the other two men. And since Mustard couldn't be wearing mustard, it must have been Mr. Green. Now, we know who was wearing what. We also know that the men attacked the men, while the woman attacked the women. Therefore, Mrs. Scarlet attacked Mrs. Peacock with the revolver. Okay, I got that far. And Mrs. Peacock attacked Miss Scarlet with the candlestick. Okay, that's why... Okay, so, gotcha. Professor Plum tackled Mr. Green with the knife. Mr. Green attacked Colonel Mustard with the wrench, and Colonel Mustard attacked Plum with the lead pipe. Body tells us that Plum had the knife since Mr. Green's shirt was slit by a knife. Plum attacked Green. Body also tells us that Green had the wrench, which by the same reasoning process gives us the final two pieces of the puzzle. By the way, only Mr. Body was injured in the argument, and the guests attacked each other's clothes after the guests themselves had changed into new outfits. Only the clothes were hurt. Translation: we need to keep everybody alive for this series, so random explanation out of nowhere. Okay, moving on to chapter or story, whichever you prefer, because this is basically a series of short stories as opposed to one whole book. Charades. Professor Plum flapped his wings like a bird as he fluttered around the lounge. "Bird!" shouted the other members of his charades team. "You're not supposed to make sounds in charades!" Of course, we're talking about possible murderers and thieves and lots of other things playing charades, so why shouldn't they cheat? Bird was correct. Well, it was either that or Twitter. 1 minute left, called Mr. Body, who was studying his stopwatch. This was turning out to be a very close game of charades. Professor Plum's team was in the lead. But now Professor Plum appeared to be lost in thought. "Give us another clue!" yelled one of his teammates. Plum shrugged helplessly. "Shrugging helplessly!" guessed his other teammate. Plum shook his head no. "Shaking your head no!" guessed the first teammate. Plum looked blank. Huh? Guessed the second teammate. Plum shook his head again. Then both the teammates cried out at the same time. "You forgot the clue!" Ba-noon-noon-shh. Plum tapped his nose happily. They got it right. They got it right that time. 30 seconds left, yelled Mr. Body. "How could you forget the clue?" yelled his teammates. Plum shrugged one last time, then waved goodbye as he headed back towards his team. "Bye-bye!" guessed one of his teammates. Bye-bye, Birdie! Called out the other. That's right, Mr. Body called, stopping his stopwatch. The movie is Bye-bye, Birdie. Bye-bye, Birdie? Cried Professor Plum, slapping his forehead. That's it! Yes, said Body. That's what I just said. Let's see. You guessed it in just 1 minute and 49 seconds. What's the score? Asked Mrs. Peacock. The other team's captain. Mr. Body studied his score sheet. Professor Plum's team is still in the lead, but your team has one last turn to win. You'll have to guess your final movie clue in less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds? Professor Plum chuckled. Impossible! Perhaps, said one of his teammates. But look whose turn it is. Mrs. Peacock was now reaching into the hat to pull out the final clue. Mrs. Peacock was not only her team's captain, she was also the best at charades. And I have a paper cut. Lovely. Okay, so I'll have to deal with that real quick. Got one. I thought I had gotten a paper cut back there, but I didn't feel anything, so I didn't think it was. There we go. That's better. Alright, where were we? Among all of Mr. Body's guests, if anyone could pull out a victory, it was she, unless Professor Plum had his hands in his pocket. One of those hands now tightened around the knife. Man, this is like their answer to everything. Playing charades? Murder! Mrs. Peacock studied the scrap of paper on which the clue was scribbled. Oh dear, this is a hard one, she began. She said, Time to begin, Mr. Body called, clicking his stopwatch. Miss Peacock waved her hands in the air, making a circle. Whole idea, guessed Colonel Mustard. Mrs. Peacock tapped her nose to show that this was correct. Then she began skipping around the room like a little girl. One of the members of Professor Plum's team now quietly drew out a revolver, but Colonel Mustard saw her do it. Behind his back, he now pulled out a lead pipe. If there was going to be any fighting, he would defend his team. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peacock had dropped to the floor and was barking like a little dog. Again, you're not supposed to make sounds in charades. Then she got back to her feet and began to spin around like a tornado. Her teammates stared at her, utterly mystified. 15 seconds left, called Mr. Body. Mrs. Peacock was spinning close to the professor. Plum's team. Just then, someone from Plum's team turned off the lights. There was a dull thud. Then the lights came back on. Mrs. Peacock was still spinning, but now she clutched her head with both hands. Headache! Cried Mrs. White. Mrs. Peacock shook her head. She pointed at the opposing team. Pointing! Guessed Colonel Mustard. Mrs. Peacock rubbed her head and said, "Ow! No talking! They've been making lots of sounds!" Professor Plum did tweeting, she did barking. You're allowing that, but you're not allowing talking? Then Mrs. Peacock fell to the floor. "Fainting!" guessed Colonel Mustard. "Give us a clue," argued Mrs. White. But Mrs. Peacock didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even breathe. Suddenly Mrs. White screamed. She ran to her captain's side. "She's dead!" said Mrs. White with a moan. "I guess we lose," said Colonel sadly. Oh no, sobbed Bobby. Body. Who would want to hurt poor Mrs. Peacock? While the other guests gathered around Mrs. Peacock, the guilty one managed to sneak the murder weapon, the candlestick, back on the mantel. I guess I'd better call the police," said Mr. Body sadly. "Wait a minute!" exclaimed Mrs. White. "I've just figured out the mystery." The guests all waited. "It's the Wizard of Oz!" shouted the maze. Mr. Body looked confused. "Why would the Wizard of Oz want to hurt Mr. Peacock?" No, said Mustard. "She means that's the final movie clue." "You're right, but there's something more important to figure out here, don't you think?" "What's that?" asked Professor Plum innocently. "Who killed Mrs. Peacock?" cried Mr. Body. "That's easy," said Mrs. White. "I've already figured it out. Since each of us had only one weapon, I know exactly who the murderer is." She turned slowly toward the opposing team. Then she raised her finger in the air and pointed. "You! Who do you guys think killed, killed, I put it in air quotes, Mrs. Peacock? Post your thoughts down below in the comments, and I will reflect on what I think and who I think. Okay, so they're going with the thought process that every single one of them only had one weapon this time around. So we need to go back and find out who had what weapon. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so whatever was used on Mrs. Peacock was the candlestick. So we need to find out who had the candlestick to find out who the murderer is. Okay, Professor Plum had the knife. Professor Plum had the knife. Colonel Mustard Great, I'm getting mixed messages here. First they say Professor Plum had the knife, but then they say he had the revolver. Mustard's guys, I think we have a typo here. One of the members of Professor Plum's team. Okay, so not Professor Plum himself. Okay, so Professor Plum had the knife. Someone from his team, whose team was Scarlet and this is why I don't think was on anybody's team. Wait, yes she was. Yes she was. But she was on the same team as Peacock, I think. Hold on. Okay, so Peacock's team has Colonel Mustard and Mrs. White. Okay. So that leaves Scarlet for the other team. Okay, so Scarlet is the one who has the revolver, which makes sense. And then Colonel Mustard pulls out the lead pipe. So that leaves the rope and the candlestick. And I feel like there's something I'm forgetting. I'm flummoxed. I can't figure out who's supposed to have had the candlestick. Unless it was Mrs. White. But why would she kill someone from her own team? Well, this is just a wild, crazy house full of possible murderers, so I'm gonna go with that. I'm gonna say Mrs. White. Mr. Green with the candlestick in the lounge. How? How was I supposed to deduce that? We know, by the process of elimination, that Mr. Plum's teammates were Green and Miss Scarlet. So there were just two teammates on Green's team? Oh, duh. Never mind. Plum's teams were Green and Scarlet. Plum had the knife. Colonel Mustard saw her take out the revolver. That leaves Green with the murder weapon of the candlestick. So we were supposed to assume that they were all on one team, the people that had the weapons, except for Colonel Mustard. Luckily, in the dark, Mr. Green's aim was off. He delivered only a glancing blow. Mrs. Peacock woke up a moment later, and then Mr. Buddy awarded the charade's victory to her team. All was forgiven. Alright, so I'm going to stop here for this installment of dramatic readings and personal stories. I hope you guys have been enjoying these mini stories from the clue book, because I am having fun like nitpicking them and poking fun at them and trying to figure out who done what. So I will see you guys next time. Bye.